Hey, that's a great prelude to the recitation of our congressional mantra, which will inspire us for the important discussion about free speech on campus that we have to look forward to. Ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, the National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Absolutely, that's what it is. And we are going to be doing so much spreading of constitutional light this spring in our town hall season. We announced the full roster on March 21st, so sign up online because it is going to sell out quickly. I am sure we have speakers ranging from Preet Bharara, the former U.S. attorney, who will be here on April 10th. Joan Biskupic will discuss her new biography of Chief Justice John Roberts. Jonathan Turley will be debating a worthy opponent about whether the president has the constitutional authority to build the wall. And George Will come, bless you, to discuss his new book on natural law and the founding. It is going to be an amazing season, and I hope that you will join us here at the center or online. Also, be sure to be here on March 7th for the opening of our new exhibit. Don't be here March 7th. No, absolutely, under no circumstances be here March 7th. Try May 7th, which is the date that we will be opening our new gallery, Civil War and Reconstruction, the Battle for Freedom and Equality in America. Friends, I've seen the mock-ups of the exhibit, as well as the incredible interactive, which in the exhibit you can touch any clause of the 14th Amendment or the 13th Amendment or the 15th Amendment and see how it evolved during the congressional debates. Plus, there's an incredibly moving theatrical performance that we're opening in connection with the exhibit on Juneteenth, with two actors reading from totemic texts of Reconstruction and the Civil War, including Frederick Douglass's petition to his former master asserting his liberty, to the debates in Congress over the 14th Amendment. It's incredibly moving, and I want you all to join us. All right, we're here to discuss free speech on college campus. This is one of the most contested questions in America today. It is urgently important that we hear from all sides in the debate, and we decide what the Constitution requires or forbids. We have a remarkable group of university administrators, faculty members, and student advocates to discuss all sides of the issue. And we have a great partner in the Academic Engagement Network, whose distinguished member, Mark Yudof, the former president of the University of California and president of Law Emeritus at Berkeley, will moderate the third panel. The first panel will be moderated by my great colleague, Sheldon Gilbert. He is the Vice President of Content and Development at the National Constitution Center. Those of you who have not yet met him will be so excited, as I am every day, to learn from his passion for the Constitution. This was my favorite student at GW Law School a few years ago. We were together, and he was guided by the constitutional spirits to join us here at the center, where he is spreading light and helping us bring in supporters from across the country. Ladies and gentlemen, to moderate the first panel, it is my great pleasure to introduce Sheldon Gilbert and his colleagues. Wonderful to see you.
All right, welcome out to our fantastic panelists this evening. First, we welcome Anita Bernstein, the Anita and Stuart Subotnick Professor of Law at Brooklyn Law School. Professor Cary Nelson will join us as Emeritus Professor of English and Jewish Culture and Society at the University of Illinois. And finally, Professor Amy Wax from here in Philadelphia, the Robert Mundheim Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. So thank you so much for joining us tonight for this profoundly important topic about campus free speech. This evening in our three different panels, we have three different perspectives. We're starting with the perspective from inside the classroom, the view from the classroom. What does free speech look like from the perspective of the professors who are teaching students at universities across America? And we want to start with this fundamental question. What is academic freedom? What does it mean? And what is it supposed to serve? So I am reminded of an undergrad professor of mine. He was a a somewhat cantankerous fellow, and he always used to say, whenever anybody complained about hearing something difficult in class, he had a phrase that stuck with me. He said that the university should be the disturber of the mind's peace. That was the phrase that always stuck out to me, and I've remembered it ever since. So, Anita, you said something similar in an op-ed that you recently wrote for the Philadelphia Inquirer. You said that at campuses across America, professors often say that part of being tough is having to listen to what you don't want to hear. Does academic freedom help? Is it designed to help students hear what they don't want to hear? Or what other purposes do you think academic freedom is designed to serve?
That's a hard question because so much of my perspective, as I've recently said, as you mentioned, is informed by the extreme comfort of my job. So what you just mentioned before about your mentor, your undergrad professors saying that what we need is to be disturbed, I think applies to all of us. And I know I dish it out and I try to find ways to take it because I think that requires more outreach and energy, sort of up against a default. I try to set up my classroom so that individuals can disagree with what I've said or say something that I didn't expect or throw a curveball that I don't know how to anticipate. And I hope with that approach to the classroom, I'm transmitting or teaching a message that it's desirable to have your comfort disrupted.
So what about you, Professor Nelson? You had a unique perch for 6 or so years as the president of the Association of University Professors. And this question of academic freedom came before you on a regular basis. What did you take away from that experience? What are the purposes and goals of academic freedom? And if you could take a minute to talk a little bit about what your views are on what academic freedom is.
Sure. Well, it's one of the most useful things you can do if you want to see the history and founding definition of academic freedom is to look at the AAUP's 1915 declaration. That's the year the organization was founded. And except for some kind of in loco parentis biases that had to do with who students were in 1915, it remains really the most eloquent statement I think that the AAUP ever produced. And that it's clear from that document that the first function of academic freedom, the reason for its existence, is really to serve the country and the world. That is to guarantee that faculty members can pursue the truth unfettered by political and religious bias and aggression, but for that purpose of serving the search for the truth. So it has evolved into a way of protecting faculty members, and indeed the AAUP did that in its first year. It also conducted its first investigations, and since then the organization has continued to define principles for academic freedom and also to investigate and censure administrative misconduct. That is, we felt, well, I wasn't around in 1915 as best as I can remember, but the concept was that religious figures, politicians, board of trustees members wouldn't understand academic freedom and would often be subject to impulses that would lead them to compromise it. So the principle was protect faculty members' ability to teach and research, including, and the document is explicit, about willing to disrupt students' beliefs and existing opinions and challenge them. That was built into academic freedom from the first moment. But it had a purpose beyond the protection of individuals, and that was to serve the national purpose of moving research forward, moving knowledge forward, and so forth. What wasn't anticipated in 1915 in any way whatsoever, other than the internet, which the organization said nothing about in 1915, what really wasn't anticipated was the possibility that some individuals, and really more importantly, whole academic disciplines, would abandon the search for the truth, would no longer be committed to that, indeed would be committed to some form of political indoctrination and to advocacy for a set of political beliefs. And that's most intense over the last decade around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where some faculty members in some disciplines have been willing to move away from that fundamental precept and to say academic freedom protects our right to tell what we believe politically, not to search for the truth.
So that's interesting. There's a lot to unpack there, but the core argument seems to be that the purpose, the principal thrust of academic freedom, of protections for faculty to be able to speak, is the pursuit of truth. Professor Wax, you've talked a little bit about the movement on many campuses to create safe spaces for students. Do you see this as antithetical to the purpose of academic freedom, which is to pursue truth? Are these ideas compatible with each other, or are they in tension with each other?
They're not compatible at all, in my opinion. And I think the turn towards trying to create safe spaces on campus to protect students from unpopular or bruising ideas, upsetting ideas, has really been a very baleful turn, and it has grievously compromised the academic mission, academic values, and integrity. And I would emphasize this term, academic values. We talk a lot about free speech, but I prefer not to use that because private institutions have no constitutional obligation to give any of their participants freedom of speech. So when I defend academic values, I don't defend it as a matter of law or a matter of constitutional imperative, but rather as a normative imperative that I think academic institutions should respect. Now, what does that require? I don't think that professors should seek to disturb their students, but I think that is a necessary byproduct of the objective, rigorous, fact-based, analytical search for the truth, to examine the merit of claims. And also, there's another mission that I think is central to academic values, which is to transmit the past, what is most valuable, the best that has been thought and said in the past, as Matthew Arnold says, in a way that is even-handed and objective, not slavishly devoted to any particular creed or cult, but rather attempts to assess ideas out of the past, the ideas that are a basis for our way of life, in an even-handed and objective way. And that will necessarily displease some students, upset them, offend them, and all of that. So my view is that when students get to the door of our general academic institutions, for them to immediately request safe spaces, by which I mean psychologically safe, obviously we have the obligation to make them physically safe, for them to demand to be protected from bruising or potentially upsetting ideas, I ask myself, why are you there? Why have you come to these amazingly elaborately expensive institutions, which cost people so much money, when it's really an open question what you think you're going to get out of it? Are we just going to confirm all your prejudices, or are we going to open your mind?
Well, let's talk about some specific examples. Recently, we've seen headlines about a law professor at Harvard, Tom Sullivan, who I think teaches criminal law. And there's a petition circulating from the students criticizing him for being part of the criminal defense team of Harvey Weinstein. And the students have expressed a serious concern, not asking that he not be permitted to represent Mr. Weinstein, or that he be removed as a professor, but that his role as a faculty dean for a particular college makes it hard for the students, particularly women at the school, to feel comfortable raising concerns about sexual harassment on campus because of his role representing Mr. Weinstein. In fact, the petition says that his representation of Mr. Weinstein is, quote, not only upsetting, but deeply trauma-inducing. Mm-hmm. Is this a concern that the university ought to be addressing? And what would be the appropriate response to this type of concern?
If students have voiced anxiety and discomfort with the notion that they could bring sexual harassment cases and experiences to him, then I think it's something the university has to deal with. They really have two options. One is to have a hearing, give him a chance to explain himself, see if he can convince students that despite representing Weinstein, he takes sexual harassment seriously and would listen to their cases and listen sympathetically. He could make that kind of position. And if students remained unconvinced by that, then I think the university can relieve him of his administrative responsibility. Or they could decide that the student petition on its own warranted removing him from that role. Academic freedom gives him no protection in his administrative role, none whatsoever. He's an at-will employee in that capacity and could be terminated with no notice whatsoever. Professor Weinstein, we'd like you to pack your belongings within the next 2 hours and leave. A dean, a department head, any kind of an administrator is an at-will employee and can be terminated. So academic freedom really isn't relevant. It's relevant to his right to represent Weinstein. That's protected, and he's protected from consequences as a faculty member, but not in that capacity.
So that's interesting. So we're talking a little bit about what the limits of academic freedom are, and perhaps it doesn't extend to administrative roles and responsibilities. That's your suggestion. Professor Bernstein,
it's the AUP position, right?
Professor Bernstein, does that seem right to you, that academic freedom should be limited to the teaching role, that schools should be able to, say, punish a professor in an administrative way, taking away the chairmanship or taking away some of their administrative responsibility or privilege?
I think it was Theodore Roosevelt who said that the President of the United States and any other administrator is a tool to be used up until it's worn out and then discarded. I'm not sure I'd fire him the way, or put fire on the table as overtly as Cary just did. But I think it would be...
He would still have his faculty job.
Of course, right, yeah, I'm not touching that at all. Whatever employment rights he has as a professor would remain. I think that the student petition is an exquisite specimen of free speech. I thought it was, what I remember reading of it, I thought it was well written and carefully reasoned. I wouldn't personally have talked about my trauma, but that's just I guess, a wordsmithing quibble. The expression of views by the students struck me as something pertinent and careful. What to do with Sullivan as an administrator is an administrative question. And I guess you're saying he was punished, and maybe he was in the sense that he suffered a taking or a deprivation of something that he wanted. But he's there to serve the purposes of the institution, and it's his boss's job to decide whether his work as an administrator is consistent with the general operation of the law school.
So this raises an interesting question about the scope of academic freedom. We've talked about limiting it to just the teaching role, and that maybe the university could respond to speech by taking away other privileges. But what about...
But it's not limited just to the teaching role, because those extramural activities, like defending Weinstein, are protected from academic consequences. So academic freedom is one of the capacities, one of the principles that protects him from a sanction for doing that as a public citizen, a university sanction.
He's protected because
in his role as a faculty member, a teacher, and researcher.
Thank you for that. Is it because he's tenured? What happens to the 76% of teachers who don't have tenure? Professor Wax, should academic freedom extend to those individuals? Does it? Ought it?
Well, first of all, I think untenured people are completely unprotected and therefore very vulnerable to sanctions for expressing politically incorrect views. And my experience going around the country talking to various audiences, academic and non-academic, has convinced me that this is an enormous risk that students, graduate students, and untenured professors are very well aware of. But let me just address this case. Academic freedom, we can argue about the technicalities of it, but my response to what happened to Professor Sullivan is very, very different. If I were the dean of Harvard Law School, I would say to the students, thank you for expressing your opinion and your concerns, but I am going to reject your suggestions because they are a thinly veiled attempt to penalize this person for performing a valuable and essential role as a lawyer to someone who warrants representation, because everybody warrants representation. So that's a teachable moment that the dean could use to instruct the students that this is absolutely essential, that everybody, no matter how nefarious, deserves a defense, number one. Number two, the students' reactions are purely emotional, reactive, subjective. They have no objective basis. It's just, we feel this way, and because we feel this way, you have to indulge our feelings. Now, to give into that is to send exactly the wrong message to the students, right? That they, through their untutored feelings and responses, get to decide who plays what role in the university. I think that is a very, very dangerous practice. I've been the victim of it. My dean, who is supposed to be appearing on the next panel, took away my first year class because students came into his office and says, we feel like we would be disadvantaged in this class. We feel like Professor Wax is biased. We just feel that way. We have no objective evidence. There is no objective evidence. There's not a shred, an iota, or a dot or tittle of objective evidence that she is in any way biased. But that doesn't matter. It's a fact-free zone. We are going to turn the careers and the fate of our professors into a fact-free zone, and you, the administration, have to give in to our reactions, no matter what the basis for them.
That would have been part of my first suggestion.
Thank you.
The dean could explain that representation of villains is a necessary part of democracy and the legal system, and try to convince the students that that shouldn't affect their attitude. But
they shouldn't try to convince them. He should tell them.
Well,
this is what you learn in law school. We are here to teach you this.
Well, that's perfectly true. But in the end, he has a function to serve. If he's to be the person to whom students report their concerns about sexual harassment, and if in the end they just feel uncomfortable in going to him in that role, and they need to go to someone, then the administrator has to deal with that, with their feelings. Even if they're not objective, even if they're irrational, nonetheless, he is imperiled in his ability to serve that function. But I say attempt to defend him, attempt to give those explanations, and then see what the reality is. But they've got to have a person to whom they can have.
Well, you're assuming away professionalism. I think that's one of the problems. To just assume about someone on the faculty that they cannot separate their vital professional role, as you say, representing accused villains, presumed villains, from their role as an advisor to students, I think is really a kind of not the kind of assumption that should be indulged.
We've talked about the Sullivan example. He's engaging in what you've described as a culturally and constitutionally very important role of defending an accused criminal. Let's talk about another context. What about a professor who is tweeting on social media about a topic that is not that professor's area of expertise? Something very controversial. An engineering professor tweeting something very controversial. It's outside the classroom, outside of the university, outside the professor's area of expertise. Professor Bernstein, should academic freedom protect that professor talking about completely unrelated subject matter on a very large megaphone?
I think Amy has enlarged or enlarged the understanding of academic freedom, so I'm not really certain how to answer it. I don't think that this irresponsible or feckless-looking tweeting should have employment consequences for him. Inevitably, and I guess this touches on what Cary and Amy were saying before, just because you don't lose your job doesn't mean you haven't suffered, and I take that seriously. I understand the Sullivan's deprivation would be painful for him. At the same time, lawyers who take on unpopular clients while they're fulfilling an important constitutional role tend to suffer some consequences with respect to other prospective clients. Sullivan is modeling not only the ideal of representing unpopular accused persons, but also the consequences for a defense lawyer in dealing with the controversy that is intake choices, the decisions of whom to represent will create. He shouldn't necessarily be cosseted from blowback or trouble based on the choices he made. Again, I guess I'm sort of in the middle between Cary and Amy. I don't really know exactly what should happen to him. I think it's a fact kind of laden question, but it seems to be correct that he both enjoys academic freedom. That freedom does even extend in an influential or penumbra-ish way to his work as an administrator, and whether he should remain as an administrator, I think, is for administrators to choose while commending and respecting the expressed views of the students. I do not think, Pache, Amy, that administrators or higher-ups in higher education are somehow not buffeted and blown by their feelings. We all have feelings. It is not the case that the people who run institutions are rational and operating only by facts, whereas undergraduates are driven by emotion and the opposite of reason. So I think we need to be a little less black and white about the authority of who makes the yes or no decisions, as if it were neutral and perfect, and caricaturing the views and opinions of students as being emotional.
Because I've written a lot about that question, let me give you what my answer has been. For many decades, the standard AEUP line was public utterances that are unrelated to your teaching and research, to your professional responsibilities, you're held harmless for them in terms of any university sanctions. That academic freedom protects you not only in your teaching and research roles, but also in public discourse, which can now, of course, be tweets or other forms of social media and so forth, when it's not in your wheelhouse, when it's not in your areas of expertise. So you can be any kind of a fool on social media outside your areas of expertise, and you're protected from university sanctions. And there's plenty of evidence of faculty doing exactly that, behaving ridiculously. However, the AEUP's position for many years was, if you make a statement in social media in any form, in an op-ed, online, whatever, that contradicts the fundamental convictions of your discipline and your areas of research and teaching responsibility, then you can have university consequences. And the example that we like to use, that we use many, many times, actually is an engineering professor who doesn't do this on campus, but publicly he claims that the Holocaust didn't happen, that it's a fake. However, he designs bridges, and it doesn't seem to much affect that. He never talks about this on campus, but he's very valuable in the public domain in making the assertion. He writes about it. I think he's done a couple of quote books claiming that the Holocaust didn't happen. He's protected because it's not his area of responsibility. But the AEP standard view was that if, say, a professor of European history was to tweet or use a Facebook post that says the Holocaust is a fake, that person's professional competence would be at issue, and what we call professional fitness would be at issue. And because the weight of the discipline is so heavily behind the fact that the Holocaust did indeed happen and that 6 million Jews were murdered, he would be demonstrably incompetent to teach, and in fact not only could be sanctioned, but could lose his job over that. Now, in 2015, the AEUP decided, over my objections, I must say, strenuous objections, to change its position and say that all comments on social media, op-eds, and other kinds of public discourse are protected by academic freedom, even in the area of the faculty members' teaching and research responsibility. I thought that was a serious error. So now it's a matter of controversy, the degree of protection that you get. When you're speaking in public in the areas of your teaching and research, obviously social media means that the influence of statements that you make can be vastly larger than anything you publish.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit in terms of the consequences of the two different rules. So if it's the area of the professor's expertise, then it sounds like under the old rule, that's where whatever the professor said would get the least protection, and the most protection would be for areas outside of the professor's expertise. Is that counterintuitive, first? And second, who gets to decide? You described it as the professor could be subject to discipline if the professor is speaking against the fundamental tenets of the discipline. The fundamental kind of accepted truths of the discipline.
Not if there's disagreements in the discipline, but if the weight of the discipline is really absolutely behind a certain truth, then you can be in difficulty in terms of professional fitness.
So this raises an interesting question, which is who's the decider on what these fundamental tenets are, and who kind of polices those boundaries? Professor Wax?
Yeah, well, no, I think that it's very easy to come up with examples like Holocaust denial, where it just seems quite outre or outrageous that someone would take a particular position, the earth is flat, that sort of thing. But, those examples are less common than you think. I think it amazes me regularly how many issues in social science, in history, in the humanities, and even in the so-called hard sciences are still in serious dispute. And I think to say that certain issues are settled canonically, and we as a discipline say that they are slam dunk, open and shut, is potentially very dangerous, because it is so easy for political biases and, let's call it what it is, political correctness, to creep into that. I can think of areas where social scientists would tell me, well, there's just no evidence for this proposition. Certain issues in behavioral psychology or biologics, it's all settled. And I happen to know it's not all settled. So I find that very risky. And we should always err, I think, on the side of giving the widest possible ambit to academic expression and academic freedom, even to the point of licensing really absurd and offensive statements, outrageous statements, because when you're in the marketplace of ideas, you need to be tough. The marketplace of ideas is not for the faint of heart. And we don't teach students that. When students arrive at the university, we need to tell them, this is a very potentially bruising operation. You are going to hear some awful things. You are going to hear some things that you believe are completely false, but you're just going to have to put up with them. Now, if you're a Holocaust denier, I think the way to meet that is for other historians to say, the evidence just isn't there, argue it on the merits, give back the evidence that counters these absurd statements. That is the way academic discourse should be conducted. And the attitude towards dissenters, even outrageous dissenters, it's very easy to be censorious and sanctimonious, to label them as evil, to hurl epithets. But I believe that with academic values go obligations. Obligations to remain as dispassionate as you can and counter positions on the merits. It's hard work.
Well, that's the nature of academic debate, and the kind of case I'm talking about is exceedingly rare.
Right.
But, there's another domain that I think, you have to face. If we're talking about the protections that tenured faculty have versus the protections that someone has on the job market and versus untenured faculty members, the things people say affect their peers' judgments of them and affect whether they're going to vote for or against tenure,
right,
or for or against a job appointment. And those things are influential, and beliefs that are held to be seriously defective are going to affect someone's job opportunities.
Right.
And it doesn't matter. And what you said about contingent faculty, part-time faculty, is absolutely true. They really don't have academic freedom protections. I spent 30 years helping contingent faculty to organize into unions. I traveled all over the country doing it.
Let's get Professor Bernstein's reaction to a lot of these ideas that are
It's a hard question of what to do with dissenters, and I think it must be the case, Cary, that you're right, that it's extremely rare for a tenured academic to be a Holocaust denier in any field. And I agree with Amy that welcoming a plurality and discomforting production of opinions is very desirable, and dissenters warrant some empathy and even solicitude as we try to decide what to do with them. Eventually, with speech suppression and speech controls, you're always trading off benefits. There are no absolutists that would permit all statements, no matter how injurious, no matter how worthless, to flourish. And I would think, let's say, the other cliche I've heard is the biology professor who says that creationism is true and evolution is false. The academic milieu, I think, could do a lot to blunt or lessen the harm of that position so that students wouldn't be mistaught by it. But I think it could be possible for this statement to be harmful enough to actually hold back knowledge. Mindful of what we were saying before, and I was agreeing, I don't think I said it overtly, that truth is the point of academic freedom. We've got a paradox of truth needing to be challenged and controverted and attacked in order to strengthen itself. But at the end, our goal ought to be to get something that actually helps the world by being true, by being factually accurate. That's why maybe I sound mealy-mouthed, but I think that the dissenting professor needs both sanction and support.
Well, can I just, we're talking in very abstract terms here, but there are certainly in academia today areas where dissent should be heard loud and clear, but there is a dominant orthodoxy that stifles dissent. Let's take the very hot-button issue of gender differences. James Damore, who wrote a memo at Google that got him fired, saying that effectively opining that the reason that women were underrepresented in STEM is that they were less interested and less capable and less able to withstand the highly competitive atmosphere there. Would he survive as a junior professor in elite academia today? That's a serious question. I submit that he would not. And that is wrong because there was evidence that supported his position. It doesn't mean that at the end of the day he would prevail on this issue, but certainly it was arguable. So there are a number of arenas, I submit, in academia where people who take unpopular positions are putting their future and their career at serious risk as a practical matter. And it is very hard to construct checks on that kind of result.
Well, let's talk about that. How do you construct checks? You've got the next panel is university administrators, right? The decision makers in many important respects. What would be the advice that you would give the next panel and other university administrators about how to shore up the academic freedoms that you are worried are being threatened? What would be your advice for those university administrators?
Don't give in to pressure from so-called protected grievance identity groups, which happens every single day of the week in the universities. Do not grovel to feminists about someone like James Damore. Say James Damore, has a creditable point of view. Now, you could say that to students. That's easy because we're in the role of trying to instruct students and guide them. It's much harder to say that to faculty members, the people who control the Women's Studies department or the sociology department or whatever. I think the ultimate check here is integrity, individual integrity of the faculty members and the administrators themselves. And there is no substitute for that. And I think that is what is seriously in danger in academia right now. Honesty, intellectual honesty, to admit that the whole issue of gender differences is not a one-sided issue.
Now, Professor Nelson, Professor Wax has suggested that individual integrity is one possible solution to address her concerns about academic freedom. You've devoted a lot of your career to thinking about structural protections and thinking institutionally about academic freedom, what would be your question to the university administrators or your recommendation?
To the Damore case, if he's an assistant professor coming up for tenure, his colleagues are going to have to decide whether his research represents a valuable contribution to the field. They're going to make a judgment about that, and I think you're right that that judgment in the current world is likely to be negative. I'm not sure I'd be willing to see a university president overturn it. But I think what university presidents, especially presidents as up the highest level administrators, need to be willing to be eloquent defenders of the principles of academic freedom. And when they feel that their faculty is violating those principles, as the faculty at Pitzer College recently did in wanting to overturn a study abroad program at Haifa University, Marvin Oliver, the president, was extremely eloquent in saying that that was a form of academic boycott. He rejected it utterly, and he refused to honor the faculty vote, majority vote, to eliminate the study abroad program. He'll probably get, more than a lot of flack from his faculty, maybe a vote of no confidence, but he did the right thing as a president. He stood up for the principle of academic freedom and that study abroad program shouldn't be eliminated. What I want from administrators more now than in the recent past is eloquence in defense of the fundamental principles of the university. And it takes some backbone to do that. In Oliver's case, the faculty may demand that he be ousted for standing up for the university's fundamental values, but that's what I want from
So
such
Professor
people.
Bernstein, backbone. That's Professor, we've got integrity, backbone, and in your wonderful op-ed for the Philadelphia Inquirer, if I can summarize it, it sounded to me like your advice is physician heal thyself to university professors, that perhaps university professors are cocooned from any sort of criticism in interesting ways and perhaps need to be more open-minded themselves to hearing criticism. What would be what's your number one takeaway for the administrators who are going to be up next for what you think your greatest concern is about academic freedom, if you're concerned about the state of academic freedom, and what would be either the question you would want to ask them or the recommendation for these administrators?
I do think physician heal thyself is a pretty good summary, but because your question is about not what we professors can do, but what the administrators and university presidents in the front row can do, I would ask them to keep in mind the voices that we're not hearing, the speech that isn't getting spoken. James Damore has a lot of followers, and he's not in the academy. Anyway, has plenty of support. There are many individuals in the university community, and I'm thinking about students in particular, but also the contingent faculty for whom Cary has advocated so long and well, and invite the administrators who have control over budgets and planning to think about how to foster speech for everybody, not just the tiny lucky minority who have academic freedom to back up whatever they want to say, and also enjoy a degree of job security that's very enviable. So for instance, I would say that small classes, other things being equal, beat large classes, because in a small class a student will typically feel a little more comfortable speaking. I've heard fascinating comments from students now that my torts class has shrunk. I teach in this 2-year JD program that my school has, and they start in the summer, and that's a minority taste. So we get a little group, it's necessarily kind of seminar-like, and I hear much more deeply the engagement of the students than I did in a large tiered lecture. And I hope that, and I know it's easy for me to say, that you can find the money and the generosity to improve the working conditions of contingent faculty and other untenured instructors so that they can share in the glory that's academic freedom, if you can. But I'm dipping my hand in your wallet and writing a check. I don't think I should do that.
Well, so this is terrific. So we have integrity, a backbone, and more money. Those are our three solutions for academic freedom on campus. Can we give a big round of applause to our wonderful guests? And we are now delighted to turn the event over to Jeff Rosen, who was, fortuitously enough, my favorite law professor in law school, to introduce our next panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to Sheldon and his colleagues for a great panel. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dean Ted Ruger of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, President Tom Sullivan of the University of Vermont, President Ken Gormley of Duquesne University, and President Julie Wollman of Widener University. It is wonderful to greet all of you to the National Constitution Center. You are distinguished educators, friends of the Constitution Center, and I'm so looking forward to our discussion about free speech on campus. Many of you heard the end of that last panel where the faculty members had some strong advice for you. Integrity, backbone, physician heal thyself, more money. And I want to start the conversation by just summing that up by asking this basic question. Should private universities, and all of you are the heads of private universities, respect the First Amendment? Should they embrace First Amendment principles? In particular, should they embrace the Chicago principles, which advocated by the University of Chicago, whose president Zimmer has insisted that private universities should respect the First Amendment. And essentially, the Chicago principles say that universities must protect speech that people find disagreeable or offensive, with narrow exceptions, including speech that violates the Constitution or the laws, that defames particular individuals, that unreasonably invades privacy. It may be restricted for time, place, and manner reasons, or unreasonably interferes with university life, but otherwise, basically, the First Amendment should be protected. I ask this question in the context of a time when President Trump has said that he's about to issue an executive order requiring private universities to respect the First Amendment or lose their federal funding. And we just had a great podcast debate on this last week on We the People. Check it out. There was a strong defense of the executive order by one advocate and an opposition to it by another, but the opponent noted that President Zimmer from the University of Chicago, although an advocate of the First Amendment applying to private universities, thought that this executive order was a bad idea because it would create a federal bureaucracy that would require universities, would require the government to decide what counted as hate speech. So if you'd like to embrace or oppose the executive order in the course of your answer, you can, but broadly I'm asking you, and we'll start with Dean Ruger, should the University of Pennsylvania Law School voluntarily embrace the Chicago principles and essentially follow the First Amendment?
Well, I think to that question, my answer is an unqualified yes. I've read the Chicago principles. I've had them sent to me many times in the past year, and it reflects our fundamental commitment to broad free speech for faculty and students, which sometimes can be quite cacophonous because when you allow all members of the faculty and all members of the student body to speak out, you get a lot of speech, and that's as it should be. But it's, I think so. Certainly the spirit and, in my reading, the letter of the Chicago principles correlate with what we're trying to do at Penn Law.
Wonderful. President Sullivan, so eager for your thoughts. You're also writing a book about free speech on campus and have thought a lot about this. Should the University of Vermont adopt the Chicago principles?
Well, first of all, a correction. The University of Vermont is a public institution.
Oh, okay.
Although you wouldn't know it from my public funding.
Sounds like the National Constitution Center.
Only 3% of my operating budget, so we say we're centrally located in the state.
This is helpful. So you had to respect the First Amendment, and what was that like? And do you think that private universities should have to do so too?
Well, I have been in both public and private institutions, and I think while we should be very clear that private institutions are not bound by the First Amendment, I think the first panelist made that point, the academic norms, I think of private institutions certainly try to follow as closely as possible as they can. At a public institution, our own First Amendment statement is very close to the Chicago principles. I wrote that statement, and I did it not following Chicago, but rather following what I saw was, I thought, the clear jurisprudence of the United States Supreme Court and the trend line from the Founding Fathers to the present, and how clearly and directly the present Supreme Court has expanded with several exceptions, 4 exceptions, expanded the almost absoluteness of the First Amendment to public institutions.
You mentioned those 4 exceptions in your writings. Tell the audience what they are.
Yes, defamation is an exception not protected by the First Amendment. Obscenity, similarly not protected by the First Amendment. The clear and present danger test, which we may get to now, known as the direct threat test, and conduct involved in a criminal conduct. Those are the 4 exceptions. If you don't fall under the 4 exceptions, I believe the present United States Supreme Court will almost always find that it is protected under the First Amendment, even if it's obnoxious, offensive. It's a very direct, linear path from the Supreme Court to the present time, in my view.
Thank you for that clear statement of the law, for that accurate reminder that the current Supreme Court has been nearly unanimous in insisting that public institutions obey the First Amendment, and also for your interesting efforts to apply those principles at private universities as well. Ken, we got 2 for 2 on the Chicago principles. Where are you?
Jeff, I like to think of them as the Duquesne principles.
Excellent, of course.
So we've been following that precept for 140 years, really. But it's what we as educators do. And so, of course, free speech, it's essential to what we do as educational institutions. I will say, even though we're a private institution, not to get too geeky on folks here, there are state constitutions, and some of them, including Pennsylvania's and California's, may protect free speech on private property. The Muhlenberg College case is one case under the Pennsylvania Constitution, so I would not assume there are no constitutional protections.
I said you couldn't get too geeky, and you can't. What does the Pennsylvania Constitution's free speech provision say, and what does the Muhlenberg case say about that?
Well, it had to do with protesters handing out leaflets to protest, I believe it was the director of the CIA at that time, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court at that time, now there have been a bunch of cases since then, said that essentially the school had opened itself up as a public forum, and so therefore the public was invited and people had a right to engage in free speech. And in California, there's a private right to free speech under the state constitution. So again, I just want to remind people that there's another set of protections on top of the U.S. Constitution. But let me just end by saying, in terms of the proposal by the current administration, these ideas aren't new. As you know, there have been legislative proposals in Pennsylvania dating back 15, 20 years, just as there's now legislation pending in Kentucky and Idaho, I believe it is. And I understand the frustration that leads to these efforts. I don't see how they work. First of all, they're likely to get struck down like many of these speech codes were in the early 90s, the late 80s. They're usually vague, overbroad, chilling of speech. But more importantly, it relates to something the last panel was talking about. Who's monitoring this thing? Who gets to decide, no, this university isn't compliant? We believe very strongly in protecting free speech on our college campus, but who's going to come in and make that decision? That will swing back and forth depending on which administration is there and which speech they like or don't like. So I don't see how it works, frankly. I think educators are the best ones to do that. I do think you can incentivize robust encouragement of free speech by perhaps providing some, incentivized grants and things like that to do a lot of this good stuff. But I think ultimately the educational institutions are the best protectors.
Thank you for all of that helpful information, both the pending laws in several states, as well as states like California, which have already applied the First Amendment to private universities, and also for your concerns about who decides and your statement that universities should decide. I should say thank you also for the superb conference that Duquesne, in collaboration with the National Constitution Center, sponsored on the First Amendment in the fall. That was one of the best free speech events we've done, and this conversation is part of our ongoing
Well, I thought it was the best.
It was absolutely until tonight. Absolutely. Another one of the best collaborations we've done is with Widener University, and the visionary Julie Wollman has started this wonderful and Common Ground initiative, which brings together students of different perspectives, economic and otherwise, to confront views that they may not agree with and debate them respectfully. And I'm so honored to be your partner with that. I'll ask you whether you think Widener should respect the Chicago principles, and just for the sake of debate, which we exist to promote, what's the argument against adopting the Chicago principles if you don't think they should be adopted?
Well, it's hard to make that argument because I don't believe it. I think, as my colleagues have said, education is about encountering perspectives that are different. That's what we do. If all we did was, when students, whether undergraduates or graduates, came to us, was reinforce what they already knew and already believed, they wouldn't be learning. They wouldn't be transforming their understanding. So we want them to encounter perspectives that are different from theirs, that challenge their beliefs, that make them uncomfortable, not physically, but cognitively and emotionally in some cases, so that they can begin to try to understand. And our Common Ground program is really focused on how do I listen and try to understand somebody else's perspective rather than shutting it down or saying that's wrong. And that's very, very difficult. That's the work of education. So I think it's hard to make an argument against free speech. The notion that free speech isn't required on private campuses, I think is almost irrelevant in that we're all about speech, learning, listening, taking in different perspectives. That's what good education is. I don't see how you do it without that. Now, there will be people who will argue, I think, that there might be places on campus where, for example, in a biology classroom, may I come in as a student and take over the class by promoting my own perspective on something that's completely unrelated to the topic. That may not be the place for free speech, but there has to be a place for that. There has to be a venue, and there have to be opportunities for people to listen to that which they do not agree with.
Thank you for that. Well, I think this is a very significant and interesting first round of questions. You have 4 distinguished university leaders from different perspectives, all embracing the Chicago principles, which is not a position I think that the majority of private universities take. At the same time, all of you, as all university leaders do, have been involved in controversies about the proper balance over free speech, and this is the time to turn to that, to those controversies. Dean Ruger, on the last panel, Professor Wax made some strong statements about the First Amendment at Penn Law, and I'm just reading from my illegible notes. She said that you took away her first year classes because students felt uncomfortable, and they said, we're going to make the classroom into a fact-free zone, and she suggested that you were taking feelings account over facts and the First Amendment. So, of course, a response would be welcome.
Yeah. Well, I showed up just 5 minutes before this panel, but thank you for...
welcome to the Constitution.
No, look, Professor Wax is a brilliant scholar and continues to exercise her trenchant voice and speak out on campus in halls like this around the country and the world. And that's exactly as it should be, even when she's criticizing me and the Penn Law School and the University of Pennsylvania. That's one thing that our academic commitment to free speech means, is that universities are quite unique places where we support and pay and make kind of stable situations, even for those who disagree most with us and those who speak out most intelligently against us. And that's very airtight. At law school, throughout the university, but particularly at professional schools, we're actually trying to do 2 very important things at once. One is, at law schools, provide probably as large a range of discourse and speech across the widest range of political spectrum, much more so than not just any corporation or more so than you see on the floor of our legislative institutions, but a broader range of views than I see at any leading media institution on Penn Law's faculty and in our student body. And we want to cherish and preserve all that speech. At the same time, we're a professional school operating in a very competitive, shifting, somewhat perilous atmosphere where law jobs can be scarce, where law applicants can be scarce, and our role is in our required curriculum to do the best we can, producing the conditions of learning to serve that educational mission alongside our free speech mission. Most professors at Penn, including me, before I became dean, and presumably as soon as I'm not dean, teach classes outside the fall of the first year, elective classes, which is kind of a form of academic freedom where students get to choose the professors from which they learn. We have an unusual in academia system early in the first year where we assign people to classes with no ability to opt in or out. And on several occasions over the last few years, over only one of which you heard about, I, like my predecessor, had made decanal decisions that our educational function would be better furthered by making a shift in the teaching assignments. I don't want to say too much more specifically on the issue that arose last year, except I guess I do want to emphasize the point that we want to have the broadest range of free speech, and all of our faculty, including those of us speaking here tonight, are continuing to exercise that free speech very securely. But we're also performing this very important professional education function, and we have to do both to be a great law school.
I just need to ask one follow-up. Was the decision to ask Professor Wax not to teach first-year classes consistent with the Chicago principles?
Well, this is where, like any, I just came from teaching a constitutional law class where we're all looking at the same text and agreeing with it. I think it is, although I understand and respect that, various people on our faculty, in the community, and in the alumni base would interpret them differently. But I think, I don't think the text of the Chicago principles solves the hard questions any more than the text of the Constitution solves the hardest things that you study in this institution.
That sounds like there's a strong argument on that score, and the Chicago principles do say that universities can restrict speech to ensure that it does not disrupt the ordinary activities of the university. Is that the text that might...
Well, I don't want to make a legalistic, at the time that this decision was made, the Chicago, I didn't make a legalistic decision based on that text, but that's an example of the way that even the Chicago principles, which are held as the kind of beacon of maximal free speech protection, embraces the notion that universities have other functions as well.
Well, this important debate, and thank you for engaging it, suggests that, as you just said, even the Chicago principles have room for debate. Therefore, President Sullivan, are they restrictive enough? You too were part of a free speech drama at the University of Vermont. You were criticized for not actively enough defending diversity and the concerns of minority students. Tell us about what those criticisms were and what your response was and how it informed your decision to write a book about free speech. And since Ted raises the point, are the Chicago principles not restrictive enough, and should the universities actually embrace the First Amendment standards themselves, which say that speech can only be banned if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence, and short of that, should be protected?
You conflated two very different pieces. So, first of all, we had very peaceful rallies and demonstrations on campus. We fully defended the First Amendment rights of every one of the people involved. We had issues of how to promote greater racial understanding on campus. Those are two very separate things. So the rights were fully protected. There were no arrests. There were no carrying out. Everything was protected under the First Amendment. We had a robust debate along those constitutional lines.
And yet, you decided voluntarily to step down. Was there any did you feel that the criticisms were fair? Was there any connection between the decision to step down and the criticisms? And essentially, did you feel silenced by the protests in ways that might violate the spirit, if not the letter, of the First Amendment?
Well, the answer to both questions is no. I had an agreement with the Board of Trustees when I was hired in 2012 that I would serve 7 years. I told the board that when we finished our capital campaign, I would announce shortly thereafter. That's exactly what happened. 2 days after we announced we completed our commitments to the campaign, I announced so that the board could have a one-year national search. So the two were completely disconnected.
Well, then what, in the spirit of my exchange with Ted, what did you take from this experience? No doubt it's a challenging situation. You've decided to write a book on free speech. What did the experience convince you about the balance of free speech on campus? What are you going to say?
Well, the word you just used is a very important one, balance. It's not a term, by the way, that the United States Supreme Court uses when it interprets. But we on college campuses have to look at those competing interests. On the one hand, the First Amendment, the robustness of the importance of speech, but also knowing where the line drawing should be between, my colleague mentioned it a moment ago, where there are interruptions or civil disobedience or civil discourse in a way that crosses the legality of the conduct. Those are situational decisions. They happen on the second spur of the moment. But on the one hand, we as administrators have a fidelity to the First Amendment principles, but know where that line is appropriately drawn between when you cross from First Amendment protection into illegality or conduct that violates the civil laws or the criminal laws. That's situational. It's very hard and dangerous to generalize unless you're in the tank at the time.
Great.
And I think we should be careful, all of us, whether we're writing or speaking or teaching or opining, to criticize folks on the ground making the decisions. We've had lots of examples of campuses across the country where controversial speakers have been brought to campus, whether it's Berkeley, whether it's Charlottesville, whatever it is. Those decisions of administrators are very tough on the ground. We know in principle and theory where the line should be, but when you're calling the shots right there, you have to make judgment calls. And we have now, unfortunately, a lot of examples in the United States in the last 2 or 3 years, particularly on college campuses. I guess, Mark, they go back to the 60s at Berkeley, where those lines become clearer for decision makers. Hopefully, the application of First Amendment principles to administrators is becoming clearer. Not all of us as presidents are lawyers. I happen to be a lawyer, so maybe it's a little more sensitive in terms of the line drawing, quite frankly, and the sensitivity to the protection of the First Amendment, but also know when there's being interference with classrooms or interference with workstations because of loudness. You should also know that the Supreme Court is very clear that we in higher education may set time, place, manner, reasonable regulations for the regulation of the application of the First Amendment. So it's not absolute, the principles. As long as the time, place, manner, restrictions, and policies are reasonable under the circumstances, universities may draw those lines. And that will be ultimately the test. What you did under the circumstances, was it reasonable? Was it important to protect the security and the safety of the people, not just in the room where the controversial speaker may be, but we as administrators have the responsibility to ensure, and this is the primary, and it even trumps the First Amendment in First Amendment law, to ensure the safety and the security of all people on the campus when you have a controversial. We've had a number of cases with controversial speakers, not on my campus, but elsewhere.
Thank you very much for that nuanced and thoughtful answer. You've reminded us, first of all, that there are a series of competing free speech rights on campus, that of faculty and academic freedom, that of students and that of outside speakers, and you've talked about the range of complicated factors that decision makers have to balance under existing case law in order to make those decisions, and you've also called for some degree of trust in the decision makers to make the decisions thoughtfully. Ken, what is the toughest First Amendment decision you have faced at Duquesne? How did you make it? And do you think that trusting the presidents is a feasible claim in an age of pervasive mistrust of institutions, when students and everyone else are demanding transparency, when no one gets any deference for their decisions, and when the kind of complicated, nuanced decisions that President Sullivan is talking about are ones that everyone wants to second guess?
I'll give you two. The second one will be short, but Jeff mentioned this national conference on the First Amendment that we had in October, and Jeff was one of our moderators as well. The whole goal of that was to bring in views from all over the political spectrum, Democrat, Republican, independent, anything you can imagine, to show that the First Amendment is actually, I truly believe, the foundation of all of our freedoms in the Constitution. And it's actually one of the few things that all citizens can unite themselves behind at a time when we desperately need things to unite behind. That was the premise of this program. And so as we were planning, we had the editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post. We had Hugh Hewitt. We had the Solicitor General of the United States, Nadine Strawson. We had videos from Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Governor Kasich. It was a dream group of people. And along the way, a fellow named James O'Keefe approached us about participating. Those of you who don't know, James O'Keefe is in charge of Project Veritas, which prides itself in guerrilla journalism, as it describes itself. So, you know, kind of catch people, sometimes posing as different people, and have video cameras hidden, and it's designed to usually embarrass people. They tend to be Democrats or Democrat-associated people who are ensnared. There was a lot of pushback when we decided, along with the Pittsburgh Foundation, to invite him. As one fellow at the Pittsburgh Foundation said, "What's a good First Amendment conference without some controversy?" You know, but we had a lot of pushback, including from our students. And the editor of the Duquesne Duke, our student newspaper, wrote a blistering editorial saying this was a mistake. We never should have included him in that conference. And you know, and a lot of people were talking about maybe not showing up as panelists or whatever, but we decided this was the right thing to do. If you really mean what you're saying about this, you have to listen to views you don't necessarily agree with. And so I called the editor in, and we sat down and chatted about it. I had been a journalist a lot of my life and on the student newspaper. And I said, you know, what I really think you should do, it was a beautiful editorial, you did a great job. I think that you should there was talk of protests if he came. I don't think you should disrupt or protest. Either don't come if you really are offended, or come and actually listen respectfully, and then write something else when you're done if you disagree with this fellow. And I told him, I did a book on the whole Clinton star battles, and I said, you know, at the time when the Monica Lewinsky story came out in 1998, you know who broke that story? A guy named Matt Drudge, using a thing called the internet. And people said, this isn't journalism. What's this internet thing, you know? And I said, so it's always changing, it's always evolving, and people have forever been posing as different people in trying to write stories. I remember a very important book, some of you probably read it, called Black Like Me, in 1961 during the civil rights upheavals, where a white guy actually changed his pigmentation to go down south to write about what it was like to be treated. Well, that was a fake to get the story. So I said to this young fellow, you know, think about these things and try to do what we really believe in at Duquesne. That's what they did. I was so proud of them. The thing went on. The world didn't end that we had James O'Keefe there. I was very proud of that. And the other quick story is that last year, the Westboro Baptist Church talked about coming and protesting. As most of you know, it's known for its hateful speech. They've protested military funerals and just said awful things about poor dead service members. And they were going to come to Carnegie Mellon University, Pitt, and then to Duquesne. We are a private institution, and we don't have to allow them on campus. And we wrote a letter to them saying that they were not invited on campus, but the sidewalks down below our campus are fair game, and we knew students would go there. But we sat down with students and talked to them, and it happened to correspond with the Founders Week, where we celebrated the founding of Duquesne by these missionaries who were all about helping the underserved immigrants who came to Pittsburgh to work in the steel mills. And the students came up with the idea. They decided to simultaneously, you have a freedom not to listen if you don't want. They held something on a different part of campus so people would not go down there, and had a band, gave out free T-shirts, and it was called DU United, Duquesne Doesn't Hate, or something like that. And they had T-shirts. And it was a wonderful thing, but the best part was that in the end, a thunderstorm came and it rained, and so the Westboro Baptist folks left, and the priest said, "We prayed for that. That happened on us."
Thank you for those excellent stories, and to the elements for blessing that protest. Julie, your toughest free speech decision, and how did you deal with it?
We're fortunate. We really haven't had an incident where we've had this kind of intense decision to be made. I would say that the most challenging decision was how to bring people together so that they're listening to each other. And we started this after the last election, and there were students who certainly felt that they felt harmed, they felt hurt by hearing other students excited and sort of gloating about the results of the presidential election. Others didn't like, and we can't have this happening in our residence halls. And how can we be allowing this? And so we really thought we've got to bring these people together and start to think about listening to each other and talking to each other. And I think one of the riskiest things that I did was to start these common ground conversations where they're open to students, faculty, staff. Anyone can come. You sign up. I don't know who's going to sign up. I don't know what topics are going to come up in these conversations. And it can get somewhat tense, but it's respectful. And I usually start the conversation by making myself vulnerable and sharing a story of, and there's plenty of them, of course, of times when I've said something that maybe shut other people down or made assumptions or, not been a good listener to other perspectives and get people talking. That's very risky because you don't know what's going to happen in those settings, but it's also really worked because people value the opportunity to have a place where they can bring their ideas and their questions, because a lot of times it's professors who come and say, I want to open up conversation in my classroom. I don't know how to do it because we've got these, I'm afraid it's going to explode if students who have different perspectives start to, have a conversation. So I think you've got to take risks and be open to listening to avoid some of these real serious clashes, which is not to say that it doesn't ensure that they're not going to happen, but you're in a place then where people are used to respecting and listening. So when something does happen, there's a better understanding perhaps.
Great. Okay, last round. The goal is to give the audience a view from your unique perspective as the heads of these great institutions. Ted, unpopular speech by definition is unpopular, and traditional First Amendment principles are unpopular. A majority of young people, according to a recent Brookings poll think the First Amendment does not and should not protect hate speech, and and younger people are even more willing to turn to authoritarian alternatives to democracy and so forth. You've taught constitutional law as a distinguished scholar. Now you are a distinguished dean. You've seen it from both sides. Is an individual dean able to defend First Amendment principles, or do you believe that some insulated body, like a court, is necessary to defend unpopular speech?
Well, I think it's incumbent on us to try, and I think it's incumbent on us to go beyond a kind of, the written word or the empty maxim of the Chicago principles, and actually look at who's speaking and any kind of normative barriers to speaking out. And we've tried to do that. One thing I completely agree that Professor Rax has written is that it is harder for conservative students who don't have tenure to speak out than faculty with tenure or than liberal students. We did about 2-3 years ago, we did an opinion survey of our students on a number of metrics and student satisfaction, and we learned a lot. But one of the questions we asked was something along the lines of, I feel my voice is heard, I feel my voice is valued. And there were 3 statistically significant groups who came in lower than the rest, and that was conservative students, black students, and women. Now you might ask, why did we spend thousands of dollars to see that an institution created over the past century by liberal white dudes is a pretty good place to be a liberal white male. But those 3 groups, there's no question there are different structural reasons. Well, in 2 cases, for African American students and conservatives, they are a minority. And one thing that needs to be said is both on faculties and student bodies, conservatives in academia are more of a minority than they're underrepresented relative to the general population. What I think have realized I needed to do better, and I've done more in the past year, is work directly with our student leaders in law schools. That usually inheres in the Federalist Society. I'm really pleased. We have an amazing student leader named Lou Capozzi, mostly due to him, but also due to some institutional support. We just topped 100 dues-paying members in our Federalist Society out of just over 700 JD students. A year or 2 ago, it was about 30. So that comes from his work first and foremost, but also something I've done with our other student groups, but I need to work harder with our conservatives, is supporting them with events and supporting their membership. And in a world where other top law schools have been floundering this semester with their Federalist Societies, our society is filling rooms, 300 people for Amy Coney Barrett a couple weeks ago, 300 people signed up to hear Jeb Bush this Thursday. So it's about, so there is a lot more we can do proactively rather than just kind of passively or loftily talking about free speech. Institutional support and individual decanal support makes a difference for any group whose voice is marginalized.
Congratulations on that superb support of the Federalist Society. That is wonderful to hear. And as you suggest, giving support to underrepresented voices from all perspectives, minorities, women, conservatives, is crucial. And the simple enterprise of bringing all sides together to be heard is necessary, which is what we're trying to do here at the Constitution Center, and why we're so glad that you're part of this conversation. So thank you for those insights. President Sullivan, you talked very powerfully about the complexity of the decisions, and then basically said, if not trust us, give us some room to make these tough decisions, because someone's got to make them. But there is no trust today. So can an individual president be trusted to deal with the complexity of these factors and to balance them, or are some other bodies necessary in this extraordinarily fraught climate on campus?
Well, I would edit your statement about there is no trust. I think there's a lot of trust on our campuses today. I think there are opinions that will challenge, and they should, as I said, under the First Amendment, but I don't like broad generalizations about there is no trust. There's a lot of goodwill, common ground on our campuses today. And what we as administrators have to do is create an environment that is conducive to robustness under the First Amendment, the concept that was used in the first panel, which I think is apt, is the diversity viewpoint. This started with Justice Holmes and Justice Brandeis that started this conversation a long time ago. And we have a lot of sharp, unpleasant, and sometimes very positive conversations on campus. I'm talking generally here, not specifically. And administrators need to be able to support the robustness of those, and at the same time, when they cross the line from hate speech, which the United States Supreme Court and federal courts have said is protected speech, whether we like that or not. I'm talking descriptively, not normatively. I may have other views myself, but the law is clear that hate speech is right now protected. And another problem, of course, is how you define hate speech. That has a different meaning for virtually everyone. I'm sure each person in our audience might share an opinion or definition of what they mean by hate speech. And that itself has constitutional challenges, because the court would look at a term like hate speech or extremist comments, which may be unpleasant or very offensive to some of us, and the court might say those terms are vague under the Due Process Clause. And by that technical term, I mean, if a term is vague, I'm not quite sure what you mean by hate speech. What are examples? A court might look at that and say, if it is so ambiguous what the term means today, hate speech versus a hate crime, that's where the line is. Then a court easily, under long-standing constitutional principles, may say overbroad or vague regulation, therefore unconstitutional application. You know this.
This is crucial. Thank you for sharing.
So we again need to be really careful on the terms we're using and what common definitions we may or may not have. But a court will look at that and say, if the term that brings in a regulation on free speech is vague or overbroad, then it will be struck down under the First Amendment, meaning it's First Amendment protected. And it also may well violate the Due Process Clause of the federal or state constitutions, because a very important part of due process, the process that is due each citizen under the Constitution. And the two most important procedural due process concepts that we should all understand is notice. When the government tries to interfere with my autonomy or my liberty, do I have adequate notice what the regulation or the charge is? And do I have an opportunity to respond or defend? If a regulation or a statute is vague, the court will say it's unconstitutional, and it'll also implicate due process because there wasn't adequate notice to tell the person that this was off grounds. So there's where we might connect the First Amendment with due process principles. And the bottom point here I would make is we need to be careful in a civil discourse that we understand the terms that are being used and that we don't try to self-impose our own normative judgments if we're trying to explain what the actual descriptive law is, or in this case, Supreme Court interpretation of the First Amendment.
Thank you for those three extremely helpful points. First, for reminding us that there is trust on campus, and it's important not to generalize from the most extreme cases. Second, for speaking with such legalistic precision about the actual requirements of the First Amendment, and for trusting our audience to follow your careful distinctions, which I know you all did, as all citizens can when you respect them enough to introduce the law, which is part of your final point, which is that the need to separate our political from our legal views, and the faith that citizens can indeed, when presented with the legal tests, understand that the Constitution and laws must be obeyed even if they find the speech abhorrent. We're nearing the end of our time, so I'm going to ask for some brief closing thoughts. Ken and Julie, I was struck by the fact that, Ken, your example of reaching out to the students for the counter-protest echoed Ted's shoring up the Federalist Society. To what degree is leadership and actually engaging with the community an important part of defending First Amendment values on campus?
I think it's crucial, and I think you have to lead by example. I've always tried to, when the law school had its 100th anniversary, our first speaker was then Attorney General Eric Holder, and our last speaker was Justice Antonin Scalia. And everyone was complaining on both directions, but then they were all thrilled and thought they were wonderful presentations. I think that's important. I think with the new generations of students, I have a series on civil discourse which is aimed at, we've talked about race and law enforcement, Muslims, immigration, and the American dream, the most difficult topics, but to teach students to do this with respect, actually listening and understanding, because they aren't getting this, folks, in faith communities anymore. They aren't getting it in their communities anymore. We have the obligation to backfill and shore that up. And I just want to end, Jeff. You know, I had the privilege of writing the biography of Archibald Cox, great constitutional lawyer. Many of you in the audience actually know who he is, which is great, because a lot of my students don't.
Remind those who don't who he was.
Well, he was the Watergate special prosecutor, but also the Solicitor General under John F. Kennedy, great constitutional lawyer. But he was acting in the role as de facto president of Harvard during the student riots of the late 60s and early 70s. And he faced a really difficult moment when there were counter-protesters coming in, students protesting the South Vietnamese dignitary, and they viewed him as the enemy, and they were shouting and wouldn't let him talk. And Cox finally stood up, and he ends his speech with this little paragraph. I copied it this morning going out the door because it's so powerful. He said, and no one heard him. These people didn't even hear him, but it was printed all over the country. Freedom of speech is indivisible. You cannot deny it to one man and save it for others. Over and over again, the test of our dedication to liberty is our willingness to allow the expression of ideas we hate. If those ideas are lies, the remedy is more speech and more debate so that men will learn the truth. If we teach that to our students, our young men and women, we will be good here in the Constitution Center for another couple hundred years.
Julie, the words of Cox are tough to follow, but I know you can do it. The last word is to you. What is next for the Common Ground Initiative, and how will it and will you teach people of that inspiring principle of the necessity of listening respectfully to the thoughts we hate?
Right, so I think the way we do that is by bringing together people who have different perspectives and ensuring that we have them in the room as we have our common ground conversations, that we're bringing speakers to campus who bring different perspectives, and that we're preparing our students to be open to those perspectives. Because I think that, you know, everyone's gut reaction, and we get into our filter bubbles, our social media filter bubbles, is I don't have to listen to that, I don't like it, I don't want to go hear that person, I don't agree with you, I'm going to shut down my thinking about this. So in every day, in every classroom, we're working on helping students to think about not just the topic, the content of the class, but also how do you open up your thinking and think critically, think analytically, seek understanding, and respect other people who you're learning alongside, no matter how different they are from you. That lays the groundwork for everything that we're trying to accomplish in our country as we try to move forward in respecting our Constitution and building a strong future.
Beautifully said. For a robust, wide open, and uninhibited debate, please join me in thanking our speakers. Very good. And now, friends, to moderate the last panel, and with thanks for your fortitude in listening to this great debate, it's my great pleasure to welcome the scholar who conceived of this conference and helped make it possible, Mark Udolph from the University of California. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to see you.
Great to see you. He'll introduce you. Okay, great to see you. Bye.
Okay, we have the diversity panel here. And I wanted to introduce our speakers. We have Samantha Harris from I'm unused to using the full name, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE. She's the Vice President for Policy Research. We have Michelle Ravinsky, Mayor, who is Vice President, Office of Equality and Diversity at Drexel University. And we have Nikki Neely, who is the President of Speech First. So we only have a half hour. And as people always tell me, I'm one of those people who's not only dull myself, I bring out dullness in other people. So I'm going to rely upon my speakers to carry the weight here. So I live in a different world than some of the previous panels, being president of the University of California. I'm an expert on riots, insurrections, occupiers, and anarchists. And so I have a number of questions, mainly focused on students, and I want to ask our panelists. And one thing I wanted to say is, which is in the discussions of academic freedom, freedom of expression is not free in America. It is not free. It cost Berkeley $6 million. At the University of Florida, they called up the National Guard. Ohio State refused to allow a speaker to speak at all. There was a lawsuit that was dismissed. It is very expensive. And at least the law is, you're not supposed to take that into account, but any president will tell you, if you have to spend $6 million on the physical safety of the campus, that's an issue. That has to be an issue. So our role today, I think, is to talk about the flip side of this. Sort of, I think almost all of us, probably all of us, are in favor of upholding freedom of expression on campus. But there is a cost. That is, students are sometimes alienated. Maybe Professor Wax would say we shouldn't pay that much attention to their feelings or whatever, but they are, and they're upset. They say that we don't belong. And so when a Milo comes to campus, or someone who is racial, I remember a speaker, one of my favorites at Vassar, a woman, a social work professor from Rutgers, who at a gender conference proposed the theory that Israeli soldiers were cutting up Palestinians for body parts to transfer them to Israeli citizens. And the president said, "Ain't the First Amendment great?" It wasn't quite the way I felt about it, although I would not have silenced her. So what I want to talk about is the role of the president as moral leader on campus. The Chicago principles, which you've heard about, they're somewhat ambiguous. And the other thing is they don't just relate to the classroom speech and academic freedom. Chicago principles say that the university is not going to take positions on partisan things. And presidents do that all the time. On DACA, they do it. On race matters, they do it. On gender matters, they do it. On President Trump, I mean, they do it all the time. And so the question is, are those the right principles? I personally defied them. The Reverend Farrakhan came to campus. He was invited by a student group, didn't try to shut him down. I said, the Reverend Farrakhan is a great guy. It happens he's an anti-Semite and a homophobe. That's my view. And I said it, but I felt that I was expected to show moral leadership, but you can't do that every day. So let's start with Samantha. What should the conscientious president do when these great controversies come to campus, who is respectful of the First Amendment and not seeking to undermine it?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's important, these major controversies do occasionally come to campus, but every day there are much more significant, I think, insults to the rights to freedom of speech and freedom of inquiry, simply that come about as the result of faculty members or fellow students who say things that, students then call for the censorship of. And so I think this is really where presidents and other administrators need to step up as leaders and need to step up and not give in to what I would call illiberal demands. I mean, students have every right to protest. I want to give the example right now from Sarah Lawrence College, a professor named Sam Abrams. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times back in the fall in which he criticized the lack of ideological diversity among college administrators. And for this, his office was vandalized. People called for him to be fired. And now, 6 months later, as part of a series of protests by a group of students calling themselves the Diaspora Coalition who occupied the president's office, they demanded that he be put up for a tenure review before a panel of the Diaspora Coalition, that the university issue an apology and condemn his op-ed, and that he issue a public apology. Now, I believe that the president of the administration, who thankfully didn't, as I feared she might, give in to the demands, but she didn't take a strong moral position. She didn't say this is absurd. This is a professor who weighed in on an important issue in the New York Times. How dare you call for him to be fired or be stripped of his tenure? And I think a lot of times what happens is either administrators and leaders of universities don't say anything at all and leave these people who have spoken out twisting in the wind. Or worse yet, in the case of Harvard with Ron Sullivan, which I know came up in the first panel, they actually, Harvard, the Dean Khurana said he was launching a climate review because of Dean Sullivan's decision to defend Harvey Weinstein. So too often there's just a lack of leadership around the core issues of free speech and due process coming from these leaders, which again is not to say that students don't have the right to protest. Sitting in an office is another thing because that's civil disobedience, but from a free speech standpoint, students can make whatever demands they want, but I think it's incumbent on an administration that cares about these things to take a strong leadership position and say, no, we stand for free speech, we stand for diversity of thought, and we're not going to, countenance these demands by even taking them seriously.
Yeah, I know your boss, Greg, was very upset at Yale because there was an opinion about what costumes to wear or something like that. And, it wasn't an academic freedom case, but it was a chance to stand up for free speech. And in my view, it didn't happen. So let me ask you, Michelle, you're probably bombarded and your president's bombarded. Everyone wants to condemn someone. It's the American way. And it happens all the time, and you worry about your moral force. You worry about whether you know the facts or not. And you have the mess that the lawyers have handed you over 200 years. So what do you do?
Well, I think that university presidents and administrators have to be engaging in conversations with their community and educating the community on an ongoing basis, so that they're not just relying on one incident or one occasion where they're really going to just be out there speaking. I think presidents and senior administrators need to be part of the conversation where we're enforcing and supporting all rights, including free speech, freedom against harassment and discrimination. All of the rights need to be protected and talked about on an ongoing basis.
But you issue a statement. At Fresno State, Mrs. Bush passed away. Mm-hmm. Some professor said, "I'm glad she's dead. President Bush was a terrible man." And I mean, a lot of students didn't like it, alums didn't like it, the others who liked it, I guess, being California. But when do you issue a statement? It's fine to have conversation. What do you do when it comes to your office? You walk into the president's office and you say, "Mr. President, Ms. President, do this."
Well, we certainly can't be responding to everything, so you have to pick the big ones. I think that sometimes you need to use your judgment and not respond is sometimes as important as responding. So I think I would say really take a deep breath and understand kind of the lay of the land, what's happening on your campus, and pick wisely on things that others are already responding to, and what is necessary for you to respond in your campus.
Does it matter to you who's protesting? You find a noose in the library, and the African American students are very upset by it, as opposed to some other sort of incident?
Yeah, I think that's one where the president needs to be very vocal, because it has a direct impact on our campus. So I think that that's one a factor also. Does it have a specific impact on our campus? Then it becomes more clear that the university president needs to get out there and get in front of it.
And that may be an exception to the Chicago rule, if it's your students and so forth. I wanted to ask Nikki what you thought about this. What would you tell the conscientious administrator Diversity and Inclusion Office with regard to the moral obligation to lead a university, even though you're not a supporter of Milo, you're not a supporter of racism or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for schools to get out in front of it before Milo comes to campus even, right? I mean, Princeton did a great job, I guess this past year, 2 years ago. They gave out Keith Whittington's book, and they incorporated free speech principles into their incoming freshman orientation. And so they laid out a marker very early on. This is what is expected of you. These are principles we believe in. Because I think, unfortunately, we have a lot of students getting to campus now who don't understand the beauty of the First Amendment, that this is something that has been used throughout history, for the past 200 years here, but free speech in general, right? It's helped abolitionists get the word out. It's helped suffragists. It's helped gay rights activists. This is something that
Jehovah's Witnesses and all.
Right, disenfranchised groups, it's often the only tool
Give me some
they've
help
had.
on this one. How do we do that? I criticized shouting down the Israeli ambassador because I thought he should be able to speak. I wasn't endorsing him or not. I met with a group of student leaders and they said, Mr. President, you don't understand. The First Amendment is for marginalized people. It is not for privileged people like you and others. That's what they told me. Now, I mean, we can talk about dialogue and conversations. How do you have a program in civic education that's mandatory? I don't know if that does any good. Is anyone listening? Well, what do you think, Nikki? How would you go about doing that?
I mean, different schools have done different things. It's sad to me that this is a problem that, this is something that people get to college not understanding this at all, right? I mean, the mere fact that, on some campuses, the first time you really understood the First Amendment is, well, this is why Richard Spencer can come. I hate the First Amendment. I mean, there's a real failure in our high schools and junior highs if we have to get to that point.
Well, I think that's true, but, the unwashed come to the university and we have to deal with them as they are. Tawny said something like that. They're on the plains of England, the unwashed young people. What do you think, Michelle? What would you? I mean, you could do a lot of education. Not you. Well, maybe you personally, but I'll start with Michelle, and then we'll go to. I mean, programmatically, is there anything to be done? We have a lot of mandatory courses. Everyone's supposed to understand everybody else.
I think University 101, that's offered for all freshmen, is a great way to introduce these topics. I think, as you said, K through 12 is a great time to educate students on free speech, academic freedom, free speech in general, so that when they come to campus, they really do understand it in the context of all the other rights that exist. I think that having dialogues on our campus, open dialogues. I know the Pennoni Honors College has dialogues. Having those kind of conversations that are well publicized and on an ongoing basis, so that students are being introduced to these, not just in the classroom, but in the extracurricular spaces on campus.
Chicago sent out a letter. There are some training type programs, letter to freshman students, and. But it's not so easy because not everyone wants to dialogue with you. I learned that from the anarchists. They really weren't that interested in my perspective.
Can I offer a couple?
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me.
Yeah, so I just want to build on what they're saying and offer a couple of suggestions. One, I think that we need to move, when talking to students about free speech, beyond the First Amendment and into why free speech as a normative value is important. Because, it's like we were talking about backstage, there are a growing number of people who believe the earth is flat again. And it's because they've never actually had to confront, okay, well, why do we know the earth, why do we believe the earth is round? What's the evidence for that? And I think we've kind of gone to that place with free speech where we sort of default to, well, of course they can say that because of the First Amendment. And so now you have a generation of students who are saying, well, wait a minute, the Constitution wasn't written for me. I wasn't considered a person in society when that was written. It was just written by a bunch of dead white guys, for white guys. And they don't understand that free speech is a value in and of itself beyond the First Amendment and the Constitution. And so I think we need to do more education around why free speech, irrespective of the Constitution, benefits everyone, and in particular, people without a voice. I also think the K-12 piece is critically important because, while yes, colleges do need to deal with students as they arrive on campus, I think that our K-12 institutions could do a much better job of preparing students. We've moved a lot from the idea of actual civics to this sort of civic engagement model in schools where students are encouraged to participate in activism without actually getting a grounding in why those things are important. And you know, there was a program, actually, my 11-year-old daughter a few months ago stood on this stage as part of a citizenship challenge that was put on by the Rendell Center. It's for 4th and 5th graders in the 5-county area. And the topic this year was why the First Amendment matters. And I went in and helped her class prepare. Her little group was among the finalists. And it was really instructive to me to talk to these kids about free speech and see what they thought, how they answered certain questions without having ever been prompted to think about them before. And then how they answered those questions when somebody had actually talked to them and challenged them on their sort of initial reactions and things like that. And from my daughter's group and all these groups, I saw so much evolution in terms of their beliefs about free speech, and it was really moving to see these kids up here talking about why free speech was important. And you know, it made me think, I mean, that was a wonderful thing, but that's a local organization that serves the 5-county area. You know, we need more of this nationwide, I think.
Nikki, I wanted to ask you, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Speech First gets into this. You know, from a lawyer's standpoint, you know, I'm talking about the students, but one is, what is the condition of your rules? What rules, are they clear? Do we understand them? What do they say? And the second thing, which needs to be discussed, is the role of the police. And again, I'm not talking about civic education, but there is a role for the police, because sometimes you have real dangers to health and safety of the campus. You have disruption. You know, in Florida, they closed down the whole campus. The libraries were closed. The hospitals didn't take patients except in emergencies. I mean, I admit I'm talking about the more extreme examples and not what Samantha was talking about, the more day-to-day sort of stuff. So what do we need to do to clean up the rules? What do we need to do about enforcement? We live in a therapeutic era, right? You break the rules and you get 2 weeks in a health facility. What's your advice? If a university comes to you and says, what does Speech First think is wrong with our rules? What ought we do about it? How do we enforce them?
Well, they would go to fire to learn how to reform. They would come to me if they wanted to get in trouble. As the non-lawyer, I would say, you know, we have brought 2 lawsuits in the past year against University of Michigan and the University of Texas, and they had policies in their books that were, we believe, unconstitutionally vague and unconstitutionally broad. Their speech codes and their bias response teams were worded in a way where it's impossible to know what you can be in trouble for. Who's saying what's offensive? Who's defining what's uncivil or rude? I mean, those are very broad terms. That's in the eye of the beholder. And I doubt it's going to be, you know, some constitutional scholar. It's not going to be Jeffrey Rosen deciding what that is. And so if you are gauging that based on impact, even if I didn't mean to hurt your feelings and I did, and you still went and complained, and I can be hauled through a disciplinary hearing, I mean, in my mind, that doesn't pass muster.
So they need crisper rules, and what should the rules say?
I mean, they would need to word them, to better define what is banned, what is not. I mean, we were talking backstage about, you know, what is a proper harassment definition. So I will let my diversity officer
protest,
friend.
but you can't prevent the speaker from speaking. Of course, violence. That was a problem at the University of Virginia. You know, I believe in free speech, but when people are carrying automatic weapons and torches, I tend to be more deferential. I mean, it just is a problem, the open carry laws and all that. What should the relationship between the administration be in interpreting the rules and with the police? Do you get, when you have a controversial speaker, do you talk to the police department on campus? Do you have a police department on campus?
Yeah, we do have a police department. Yeah, they're actively involved, and it really is, I think it has to be a partnership. So we have a team that comes together to look at from all different angles. I mean, understanding, setting clear expectations to make sure there's safety on campus, but allowing the speech to happen, and having people who are listening to the speech understand that they have rights too, that everyone has rights. But I think there's multiple players in this situation. Part of it is safety, but part of it is education before you even get to that part.
What do you tell the police to do? Ultimately, the administration is responsible for the police, just like a big city mayor or whatever. At the end of the day, he or she may be a flautist or an English professor or whatever, but they're police chief for that campus, particularly when there's an exigency of some sort. What do you tell the police?
is allow the speech to happen unless there's an imminent threat of safety.
Okay, and who makes that judgment?
The police chief.
Please, do you instruct the police chief?
That's not my particular role on
Okay.
campus, but there is a team of people that review those plans.
Should there be someone from the administration there, dean of students, deputy, whatever, an associate dean of students?
Should be there
on
during
site?
this.
Because
Yeah.
I mean, there is civil control over
Yeah.
university police. You know, at San Francisco State, there was a big problem, and there was an administrator who made the call, and the speaker could not finish the speech. I mean, that was it, and she just didn't want to make the call, and they just were caught flat-footed, I would say. What do you think about that problem? I know that's far from your, you know, I don't understand the reasons for the First Amendment and the search for truth. By the way, it doesn't always get to the truth, by the way, the First Amendment.
You know, I think in terms of the relationship between universities and the police, I think one thing is that the police need to be better trained in how to handle some of these speech controversies on campus. I think some of them, you know, like some of the things we've seen at Berkeley, there are situations, particularly when protesters and people come from off campus, that just escalate beyond anyone's control and what anyone had expected. I mean, there are going to be times, just as there are times in society at large, where police and others who are preparing for security and things are going to be caught by surprise by either the ferocity of something or the size of a crowd. So obviously, those things are going to happen. But for example, there was just a case, we just wrote a letter to the University of Portland because the police there stood down and allowed one protester ringing a cowbell to shut down a speech because they didn't want it to become a dangerous situation. And I think that, you know, there needs to be, I mean, and it is funny, and, you know, for those of us who are familiar with the, you're going to need more cowbell, you know, Saturday Night Live sketch, that was the first thing that came to mind. But, you know, there needs to be a better understanding by police, some of whom are not necessarily trained in these free speech issues, that they do have an obligation, that their primary obligation is to protect the right of the speaker to speak and of the audience to listen. Obviously, there may become a point when things spiral out of control and become too dangerous, and obviously public safety comes first. But what we've seen in many instances is, you know, campus police or even, you know, security who've been brought in erring much too much on the side of shutting things down before it gets to that situation. But I also think there needs to be better education of students of the line between acceptable protest and disruption. And it's not an easy one to figure out because protest doesn't have to be completely silent, right? You can boo,
Sure.
but when
I've done
something
it.
becomes a sustained disruption, that is not a protected exercise of free speech because you're disrupting the speaker's right to speak and the audience's right to listen. And of course, this is also, we're talking about, you know, a speech like this and where people have been invited to speak. It's different if somebody's just speaking in the public square and someone else is trying to drown them out. That sort of competing voices situation is different. But I think we're all thinking of sort of the same situation where a student group invites a speaker to speak and then someone else decides to shut it down. And I think there needs to be better training about you know, the need to protect the speaker's right to speech and to only shut things down as a last resort.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the law is drifting that way in an unsteady. It's called the heckler's veto. You know, is do you allow the people who are objecting to the speech to prevent it from happening? But most of the cases are very old, but they're drifting in the direction you say. That is, you have to, your first obligation as a speaker, but if you have one police officer and 10,000 rioters, it's probably all right to drive the speaker off. So it's a reasonable course of conduct to you know, provide for the health and safety in this situation. Should the police, and I ask this out of experience, in the modern world, you mentioned Portland and a cowbell, a grave threat to the polity. What happened to Paul Revere? I don't know. You know, if you're advising the president, wouldn't you prefer, Nikki, to have, in a big campus I'm talking, a full-time police officer doing intelligence work? And I don't mean snooping on people and spying in the physical sense, but all they do is talk on the internet. And you can tell how many, and even the off-campus groups, which I admit are a big problem, you know, are they going to come on campus and all the rest of it? I mean, it may be a violation of the use all reasonable steps to protect the speaker if you don't do your homework. And you have the capacity to do it. Now, it's expensive. I'm not saying that it's cheap, but what do you think about that, Nikki?
I mean, I'm a libertarian, so I don't like the idea of policemen just listening all the time. No, I mean, it's,
They're just reading. They're just reading.
Just reading. I think, in my mind, the biggest threat to free speech on campus actually is from silencing. I'm more worried about chilling, that students are not talking, they're not having conversations, they're self-censoring because of these confusing, overbroad policies, the way that students see some of their colleagues' problems adjudicated on campus. I think a lot of them feel that universities are picking winners and losers, and they feel that they're not, that their concerns won't be taken seriously, and so they just refrain from having difficult conversations altogether. And that's what concerns me more than the odd protest is just, if you are paying $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year in tuition and room and board, and you're not having hard conversations and you're not learning anything, that's a waste of money.
A lot of the pressure is peer pressure too. There's sort of there is a stealth problem. I mean, I once was in charge of arranging a venue for Alan Dershowitz at Berkeley. It's not easy to represent Alan Dershowitz. And we couldn't get a single department to invite him. Not a single department until we got to the Jewish Studies program and the chancellor. They did it. I don't know what to do about that. I mean, I think the fear in untenured professors, I think in my classes, there are issues I was having trouble in my con law class discussing, like affirmative action. It just was to some people. And I talked to criminal law professors. Many of them no longer teach the law of rape in their criminal law courses in law school. That's a reality. Because, I don't know the exact size, but some, many, most, I don't know, women find it very hurtful to get into those issues. But to me, that's a problem. That's a problem. I don't know how you reform it and make the law of sexual assault work if in a law school you can't discuss the state of the law, where it should be headed, and how to punish the miscreants. I mean, to me, that's at the heart of the matter. Does anyone have any ideas on what we do with stealth boycotts and stealth silencing and shunning?
Can I?
Oh, shun away.
No, what I was going to say is I think that what we've seen in opinion polling and things like that is that a majority of students actually do support free speech.
Yep.
But I think that we are allowing on campus a loud minority of people who really oppose free speech and open debate to sort of cow the rest of us into silence. And I think that, because you hear from people all the time, faculty or other students who are facing these situations, that they get a lot of silent, emails of support and things like that, but no one's speaking up for them publicly. So for example, Sam Abrams, the professor I talked about, right? The group of students occupying the president's office demanding, his public apology and public shaming, a very small group of students. Where were all the other students speaking up and saying, we support you, we support your right to free speech, you should be able to write these things? So I think part of the way we solve this problem is people need to have the fellow students, fellow faculty, because I know faculty are scared. So when they see one of their colleagues getting in trouble, they don't speak up because they're scared, but they should speak up because they're scared. They should speak up and say, no, this is unacceptable. We need to create a culture where the majority of us who actually do support the right to free speech are speaking up for it and are speaking up in defense of people who are facing censorship, because the isolation that people feel when they're in these situations and no one's speaking up for them is really profound. If you knew that if you had one person calling for your censorship, you'd have 10 people writing, equally vociferous op-eds and letters to the editor and holding protests against your censorship, it would be a different ballgame. And that opinion, that sentiment is out there, but it's quiet because of fear, and we need to change that.
Well, the truth is, many students, it's not just fear, it's lethargy, and they don't want to be involved. I mean, I can never get a chemistry professor to speak out if he or she thinks they're on the way to a Nobel Prize. They're not going to speak out on some public issue that they consider damaging. Well, I think, if I have this right, we're about out of time. And I've been very careful. I didn't create a safe space, but I engaged in no microaggression to my knowledge. And I want to thank our panelists for being here. You did a terrific job. Thank you all. That was great.